Hi folks, welcome to my makeshift animation studio here, and the topic for today is going to be the great race to invent photography. Now, I'm going to tell you right at the start that I'm going to be taking a few liberties. I'm going to be simplifying some very complicated history for you. But the skeleton of the story is pretty true to life, and there were other things happening in other parts of the world, but we are going to be looking at France and England as the place where photography was invented, even though historians have actually uncovered almost simultaneous inventions of photography in other parts of the world. So the time is the early 1800s, the very late 1700s and early 1800s, and the Industrial Revolution is really kicking in, and people are capitalizing on the science that was done during the Age of Reason, during the 1700s, and industrialists are starting to harness those scientific experiments into technology and building factories and building a lot of wealth for themselves. So invention was in the air, and all sorts of things were happening. Chemically, some of the chemistry that was needed is coming together. The camera had been around for a long time, but the film was the stumbling block. Now I'm just going to introduce you to the three racers here. I'll pick on Mr. Daguerre first. Okay. So Mr. Daguerre was, his name sounds French, and he was Parisian. He had grown up loving art and was being employed by the Paris Opera as a scene painter. He used the camera obscura and the camera lucida, which were mirror type and lens focusing things that artists could use to help to draw, but they couldn't freeze their drawings like on a piece of photo paper. Daguerre was going to become very wealthy during his lifetime. He was able to build something called a diorama, which was a big tourist attraction in Paris, and that gave him kind of a huge advantage over some of the other characters in our story who may not have had quite as much money. So that's Daguerre. The one with the N, okay, this is Mr. Niepce, and this sounds French too. But Niepce was not in Paris. He was living out in the country on his family estate. At the beginning of his life, he had wealth and land, but we're going to find out that towards the middle of his life, or a little bit later in his life, some of that financial security kind of went away. Now Niepce was busy trying to help the printing trade. Gutenberg invented the printing press around the 1500s, but there wasn't a real good way to make pictures printed onto posters or newspapers. So Niepce was working on a method of taking a photograph and turning it into a printing plate. What he didn't understand until he'd actually done it was that he was going to successfully create a type of photography, which was not what he set out to do, but this is the way that creativity works sometimes. Our third runner has a T, and that's for Mr. Talbot. He's an Englishman, and he's very well educated. He comes from an aristocratic family. He has quarters in London. He has quarters out in the countryside. And if any of you have watched any Harry Potter movies, you've actually witnessed corners of some of Talbot's family's property, because now they're used by the movie industry to make pictures like Harry Potter. Well, you know, a long time before that, Talbot had accomplished many things. He was a statesman. He represented his district in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. He'd been a brilliant mathematician and scientist, and he'd been a teacher at some of the big universities. And he hung around with inventors and scientists and historians. So he had a lot of advantages going for him. He had a super academic background. And the French and the English are not always on the best of terms with each other. There's kind of like a blockade between the two. And sometimes there's actual warfare that's going on, and other times there's kind of an uneasy cooperation that's going on, but there's always a competitive side. So picking these two countries, England and France, to be competing in a race to invent photography is kind of upping some of the stakes a little bit. So I'm going to try and talk you through the general idea here, and I'm going to allow you guys to do the research in your textbook and try and find out the details, and you can nail down things like exact dates and places like that. So we're going to start our race right about 1825 or 1826. And we're going to put all three of these people at the starting line. Okay. Now, I'm going to put Niepce in the spotlight here, because in some respects he's going to get out of the starting gate faster. Daguerre at the beginning is all caught up in his diorama and his sign paint or his set painting. So Niepce starts messing around with lenses, and he needs some lenses, so he goes into Paris and he visits a lens maker. And the lens maker says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And Niepce talks a little bit about his experiments. And Niepce goes back to the countryside, and he works with a very simple camera that's called a kind of like a camera obscura. It has a lens in it that focuses light. But he had decided to use a metal plate, and it was a nickel piece of metal that was flattened out and nice and smooth. And eventually he figured out that he could coat that with a sticky tar-like substance called asphaltum. people in etching and engraving have used asphaltum for years, but they used them as what's called a ground, meaning a protective layer, and then they scraped through that and would put the plate in a bath of acid to etch lines that could later hold on to ink. So Niepce was using some materials from other forms of printmaking, and eventually he discovered that if he left this asphaltum coated plate in his camera long enough and pointed it out his window, he would take a picture. It would be a very blurry picture, but he was able to record a picture. So we're going to move him a little bit ahead. Now, I'm going to pull back on Daguerre for a second, because in the background here we have Talbot. If we were really being objective and looking down from the sky and seeing what was going on, Talbot had made some pretty big gains with his invention of photography, and he had outlined the process in theory in his notebook, and he'd actually made some experiments, but he was a person who started lots of projects and decided, oh, this one's more interesting than that one. So he kind of put everything on the shelf. So I'm going to put him way back here in the race. He doesn't know anything about Niepce, and he doesn't know anything about Daguerre, but he's kind of invented a form of photography, but he hasn't published a scientific paper, and he hasn't shared it with anybody. So he's not quite in the race. I'm going to move Daguerre up a little bit here, because Daguerre is actually going to the same lens maker that Niepce did in Paris. And the lens maker kind of spills the beans and says to Daguerre, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm trying to perfect a form of photography." And the lens maker said, "Funny you should say that, because just a month ago I had Monsieur Niepce coming in, and he was doing the same thing." So Daguerre started to write letters to Niepce, and Niepce was being pretty cautious here. Niepce felt like, I've got this under control, and I don't need a partner. Well, Daguerre was not a chemist. He was an artist, and he didn't understand physics, and he didn't understand chemistry, but he had a need, and he had a terrific sense of business. And he kept proposing to Niepce that with his backing, because he had a lot of money. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Niepce lost a lot of his land around his family home. There were some litigations, and there was a loss of income. And so Niepce is ahead in the race, but his research money is running out. And eventually he does team up with Daguerre. So now we have a team of Niepce, Daguerre, and Daguerre said, "I'll share my secrets with my lenses, and you share your secrets with your chemistry." And historians are kind of debating about who was telling the truth and who was pulling somebody's leg. The way I read it, Daguerre was kind of pulling Niepce's leg, that Daguerre inflated his technicalities and said that he was further along. Well, the two of them were working together, and then something very sad happened. Uh, Niepce went up to heaven. No more 3 people in the race. Daguerre inherited Niepce's notebooks. And don't worry, there is another Niepce. Niepce's son is in the picture, but Niepce's son is just, he's not part of the photographic invention process. He's just managing some of his dad's things. And eventually they do get to sign an agreement, and they change the name of the company from Niepce Daguerre, and they put Daguerre in the first place and Niepce in the second place. Now I'm going to give Daguerre a lot of credit, because Daguerre gutted it out, and Daguerre studied the notebooks, which would be like you and me looking at some really advanced math or physics, and probably we'd just be scratching our heads about it. But it is rumored that Daguerre did so much trial and error that he actually did stumble on how to make a picture on a piece of metal. Now, he was using copper plate, and he had covered it with silver, and then he had sensitized the silver with an iodine fuming process. And he would put the plate in the camera and take a picture, a long picture, but most of the time nothing happened. The story goes that one day when he had taken one of these long exposures, he kind of looked at the results and he said, oh boy, another failure, and he put it back into his box. And inside the box was a bottle of mercury, and the mercury had the lid off. So as Daguerre is sleeping all night long, inside that box, the mercury fumes are starting to work on the exposed piece of copper coated with silver. And Daguerre walks into the lab the next morning, and he pops open the lid on the box, and he looks, and he sees a picture. And it's not long before he deduces that what he has done is invented a form of developer, a developer that can be used to make a picture come up after a shorter exposure. Niepce's exposures were 8 hours long. They used asphaltum on top of nickel, and they were developed with washing of lavender oil. Daguerre's process is very different. Okay, copper, silver plate, exposed, put over iodine fumes, exposed, and then developed over mercury. So he got pretty excited, and he introduced this. He let the rumors go out that he had finally figured out how to make a permanent picture that had lots of detail. Niepce's pictures were very fuzzy, very low resolution. Daguerre's pictures were very sharp, and they are sometimes nicknamed the mirror with a memory, because they really did record all of the detail that was out there. Now, there was one little hitch. Daguerre's pictures were not permanent. They would fade after a while. And Daguerre knew that if he was going to make money and franchise, that was his idea. He was going to get the patent on this and then set up a bunch of franchisees, and then he would retire and live off of the income of Daguerre typists who would take pictures all over the world. But he had a problem. And that problem was to invent what we call now fixer. Fixer, meaning it'll make the picture permanent so the picture won't fade away. Well, the newspapers picked up on this story, and Mr. Talbot over in England heard about it. And he came out of hiding. And we're going to put Talbot back in the race here. He kind of came out of hiding, and he wrote to the London newspapers, and he said, whoa, wait a minute, don't give any credit to Mr. Daguerre. The English scientific community has given me the opportunity to invent photography. And they said, okay, show us. And he put together some pictures. Now, his pictures were on paper. The picture was actually soaked in solutions of silver compounds like silver nitrates and silver chlorides. And then the paper was allowed to dry in the dark, and he would put that in his camera, and he would take a picture, and then he would fix it in salt water, and he had what was called a negative. All of the light areas were dark, and all the dark areas were light. So he really clicked. It really clicked, and he said, now all I have to do is take this negative and put it together with another piece of photo paper, and I'll shine light through the negative, and then I'll develop the photo paper and reverse all of the tones. So one thing that you're going to put in your memory banks, and really, really remember this, is Talbot is the one who gave us the negative positive process. And that will be developed into the dominant type of photography for all of the 20th century. We call it roll film, but it is silver-based gelatin. However, Daguerre had his publicity machine whirling, and Daguerre did find his fixer, and Daguerre made such a hoopla in Paris, they convened the whole scientific community, and Daguerre, I think it was 1839, Daguerre stood up and lectured everybody about his process, and the French government said, this is wonderful, we are going to give you a pension if you give us the rights to release this to the rest of the world as a goodwill gesture. The French government was trying to get some good PR for itself. And Daguerre agreed to that, except he said, England cannot have the daguerreotype. And that was just that old animosity between the two. Well, the problem with the daguerreotype was that it was a one-shot. It was not a negative process. So if you required, 6 8x10s of yourself to give to people, you had to sit down for the camera that many times, which was really untenable. You couldn't do that. So Talbot took his process and turned it into a more commercial type. Now, if you match the two together, daguerreotype and the Talbot type, because the Talbot type was done with paper, it is not as sharp in detail. If you really wanted the sharpest detail, you had to go to the daguerreotype to see it. So we don't know who actually won the race. In some respects, it was Daguerre, because daguerreotypes studios were started at every port city around the world. There was this tremendous interest, and Daguerre had written a book about how to do it, and people in Paris had already been making cameras and lenses, and they were starting to make all of this stuff. And meanwhile, Talbot was kind of keeping everything pretty much under his hat. And he wasn't sharing and he wasn't franchising, and he kept challenging other people who were doing a type of photography that looked like it was infringing on his. And he got a little grumpy. And in fact, some of his science friends had to tell him to chill, just calm down, calm down. You are actually, now that you've invented photography, you're actually inhibiting, you're becoming a roadblock to it. So about 1850, we have a brand new, a different kind of photography called wet plate collodion photography. And that's going to take the best of both. It's going to take the detail from the Daguerre type. It's going to take the positive, negative, the reproducibility from the Talbot type, and it's going to combine those into glass plate, wet plate collodion photography. So our friend Niepce, okay, we honor his memory. He kind of got the ball rolling. We remember Talbot for the fact that he's a really smart guy, and in his notebook and with some of his experiments, he was inventing photography, but then he put it on the shelf. And then we have Daguerre, who was the promoter. He was like the Barnum and the Barnum and Bailey show. He was the promoter, and he was the person that wanted to really make it happen. And even though he didn't have the inventive trait that Talbot and Niepce did, he had the drive, and he took those notebooks and he actually invented something that Niepce may not have ever come up with. So we have to give Daguerre some kudos for doing what he did. Just remember, this was all happening 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and then we have a new type of photography that is going to be called wet plate collodion photography. So I hope that helps out. I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about who got involved in the race. And you're going to hear that there were people in Brazil. You're going to hear there were people in Scandinavia. You'll hear from the Russian folks that there were people in Russia who had invented it first. It just gets very complicated. So photo history books tend to say these three people were actually the ones that were inventing. All right, we'll see you.